My name is Dr. Eris Thorne. In a family of high-powered litigators and corporate sharks, I was always the lab rat, the disappointment who chose petri dishes over precedents and molecular biology over mergers. My father, a man who views the world as a series of winnable lawsuits, and my brothers, who measure success by the cut of their suits, saw my PhD as an expensive hobby. They looked at me with pity across the mahogany dinner table, mocking my dirt and microbes. But then, the unthinkable happened. A devastating synthetic blight hit our family's agricultural empire, the very source of the Thorne wealth. The lawyers were useless. The lawsuits couldn't stop the rot. Overnight, my family was facing total liquidation. Now, they are begging for my help. They think I'll save them because of family blood. They don't realize that science is cold, calculated, and carries a very specific price. I have the cure, but I don't want an apology. I want the land. The smell of formaldehyde and sterile steel was my sanctuary. For 6 years, I had occupied a windowless laboratory at the university's biosciences wing, far removed from the glitz and predatory atmosphere of the Thorne law firm. To my family, I was a ghost. I existed only during holidays when I was expected to endure my father's lectures on the futility of academic pursuits. I remember my father, Silas Thorne, standing at the head of our dining table during my 28th birthday dinner. He didn't toast to my research grant or my published paper in Nature. He toasted to my brother's Marcus's recent promotion to senior partner. "Success, Marcus," Silas had boomed, his voice carrying the weight of a man who owned half the city's real estate. "Success is tangible, it's power, it's the ability to bend the world to your will." Then he looked at me, a flicker of genuine confusion in his eyes. "And to Eris, may she one day find a way to turn her little experiments into something that actually pays for her dinner." I stayed quiet. I always stayed quiet. I didn't tell him that my little experiments were focused on bioengineered microbial soil restorers, nanotechnology capable of reversing chemical toxins in Earth. To Silas, if it didn't involve a court order or a hostile takeover, it wasn't work. "Honestly, Eris," chimed Marcus, swirling a glass of Bordeaux that cost more than my monthly rent, "don't you get tired of being a lab rat? You spend all day looking at mud. You're a Thorne. You should be arguing before the Supreme Court, not counting bacteria. It's an embarrassment to the legacy." My younger brother, Leo, just chuckled. "Leave her be, Marcus. Every family needs a charity case. It makes us look grounded when we mention our scientist sister at the country club. Just don't ask us to fund a startup, Eris. We like investments with actual returns." They didn't see the fire behind my glasses. They didn't see the hundreds of pages of patents I had quietly filed under a holding company they didn't know I owned. I was building a world they couldn't understand, while they were busy guarding a castle built on sand. The Thorne wealth was rooted in Thorne Agri Holdings, 10,000 acres of prime fertile land that produced specialized organic crops for the global elite. It was the black gold of our family. My father viewed that land as a sacred ATM, a resource that would never dry up. The lawyers protected the titles, but no one was protecting the soil. Then came the Blight X. It started at the south border of the estate, a fast-moving, aggressive fungal pathogen that turned verdant fields into gray, toxic dust within 48 hours. It wasn't natural. It was a bio-weaponized strain, likely a result of industrial runoff or a competitor's sabotage. Within a month, the Department of Agriculture placed the entire Thorn estate under a permanent quarantine. The crops were condemned. The soil was declared biologically dead. The bank loans secured by the land's productivity were suddenly called in. The Thorn law firm, for all its brilliance, found itself in a trap it couldn't litigate its way out of. You can't sue a fungus into submission. I watched from my lab as the headlines began to circulate. Thorn Empire on the brink of collapse. I saw the drone footage of our family's pride, the emerald fields turning into a wasteland of ash. My phone, which usually remained silent for weeks, began to buzz incessantly. It was Marcus, then Leo, then, finally, the man himself, Silas Thorn. "Eris!" My father's voice sounded different on the phone, thinner, stripped of its usual arrogance. "We need you at the estate, immediately. There's a crisis. The state experts are saying the land is irreparable. They're talking about a 50-year recovery period. We lose everything if we can't clear the quarantine in 30 days. I thought my mud was an embarrassment, Dad. "Don't be petulant, Eris. This is your inheritance on the line. Marcus says you've been working on some kind of soil thing, a serum. If there's even a 1% chance you can fix this, you owe it to the family to bring your research home. We'll set up a lab in the barn. We'll give you whatever resources you need." "I don't have resources anymore, Silas. The banks have frozen your liquid assets. The lawyers are already circling for the carcass. But you're right, I do have a solution. I've been testing Project Gaia for 3 years. It doesn't just treat the blight, it eats it and converts it into nitrogen-rich fertilizer. I can clear the quarantine in 2 weeks." There was a silence on the other end. I could practically hear the gears turning in his legalistic mind. 2 weeks? Eris, if you can do this, the Thorn name is saved. We can relaunch. We can sue the government for the quarantine delay. You'll be a hero. I'll even consider giving you a seat on the board. A small one, of course. "I don't want a seat on your board, Dad, and I'm not bringing my technology to the barn. If you want my patent, we're going to do this my way, on my terms." I hung up. I looked at the small vial of glowing blue liquid on my desk. It was the result of a decade of being ignored. It was the lab rat's revenge. My family thought they were calling a daughter home to perform a miracle. They didn't realize they were calling a predator who had finally found their jugular. I spent the rest of the night drafting a contract. It wasn't a family agreement. It was a hostile takeover. I was going to offer them a choice: keep their pride and lose the land, or save the land and lose their power to me.
My dear ones, thank you for listening to this story. It makes me incredibly happy to feel that you are here with me. I try my best for you and post new videos every day, putting a piece of myself into them. If my stories resonate with you, your subscription and viewing of other videos will be the warmest support for me and inspiration to continue telling stories.
The iron gates of the Thorn estate, usually a symbol of impenetrable wealth, felt like the entrance to a funeral pyre. As my car wound up the long driveway, the emerald green that had defined my childhood was gone. In its place was a gray, choking haze. The magnificent oaks were shedding blackened leaves, and the air tasted of sulfur and decay. The blight hadn't just hit the crops, it was eating the atmosphere of the place. And there, standing on the marble steps of the manor, were the 3 men who had spent 20 years making me feel small. They looked like ghosts in tailor-made suits. My father, Silas, stood in the center, flanked by Marcus and Leo. They looked desperate, their eyes darting to the heavy, reinforced cases I was unloading from my trunk. They expected me to run to them, perhaps even apologize for my coldness on the phone. Instead, I stood by my car and put on a pair of sterile nitrile gloves. "Aris, thank God you're here," Marcus shouted, starting to walk toward me. "The bank sent a final notice this morning. We have 72 hours before they begin the foreclosure process on the northern tracts. Bring those cases inside, let's get a drink, and you can show us how this blue stuff works." "Stop right there, Marcus," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. I held up a hand. "Do not come within 10 feet of me or my equipment. You've been walking through the infected zones. You're a biological hazard." "A hazard? Aris, don't be ridiculous. It's just fungus. I've had my shoes cleaned." "The Blight X is a synthetic, hyper-evolving pathogen, you idiot," I said, stepping forward with a pressurized canister. "It hitches a ride on skin cells, fabric, and even the oils on your hands. If you touch my equipment, you contaminate the base strain of the cure, and then we all lose. Now, all 3 of you strip right here." "What?" Silas roared, his chest puffing out. "I will not be told to disrobe on my own front lawn by my daughter. Have you lost your mind?" "I haven't lost anything, Silas," I replied, looking him dead in the eye. "But you're about to lose 10,000 acres of prime land and your entire reputation. Either you step into the decontamination tent I brought, or I turn this car around and watch the Thorne legacy turn into a parking lot on the evening news. Your choice. You're the lawyers. Weigh the evidence." The silence that followed was delicious. I watched the internal struggle play out on Silas's face. His pride was battling his greed, and, in the Thorne family, greed always won. Slowly, with shaking hands, the patriarch of the Thorne family began to unbutton his charcoal vest. Marcus and Leo followed, looking like shamed schoolboys rather than corporate predators. I set up the portable decontamination unit, a pressurized tent that sprayed a fine mist of my proprietary antimicrobial solution. One by one, I forced them through it. I watched through the transparent plastic as they sputtered and coughed in the mist. It was the first time I had ever seen them stripped of their armor, their suits, their watches, their arrogance. "Welcome to my world," I whispered to myself as I began to unpack the high-precision sensors. Once they were cleared, I allowed them to lead me to the library. The room was a monument to old power. Thousands of leather-bound books, mostly law texts and histories of great conquerors. Now it served as a war room. Maps of the estate were spread across the central table, covered in red ink marking the dead zones. "It's everywhere, Aris," Leo said, his voice trembling as he pointed to the maps. "The soil pH is off the charts. Nothing grows. Even the weeds are dissolving. The federal inspectors say the land needs to be salted and abandoned." The federal inspectors are using 20th century logic for a 21st century weapon. Blight X doesn't just kill plants, it restructures the soil's molecular lattice to prevent water retention. It's a terraforming agent. Someone didn't just want to ruin your crop, they wanted to erase the land's value for a generation. "Who would do this?" Silas asked, his voice hollow. "That's for you and your legal team to figure out," I said, leaning over the table. "My job is the how. My Project Gaia uses a specialized strain of extremophile bacteria. They don't just survive in the blight, they treat it as a fuel source. They break down the synthetic toxins and leave behind a nutrient-dense byproduct. It's a total soil reset."
"How much of it do you have?" Marcus asked, his eyes gleaming with the return of his predatory instincts. "If we have the cure, we can license it. We can sell it to the neighboring farms. Aris, this is bigger than just our land. This is a multi-billion-dollar patent. We can form a new subsidiary under the Thorn umbrella. You'll be the chief scientist, and I'll handle the commercialization." I looked at Marcus, really looked at Marcus. Even at the edge of ruin, he was already thinking about how to colonize my work. He didn't see me as a sister, he saw me as an asset to be managed. "There will be no Thorn umbrella for this technology, Marcus," I said. "The patent is held by Aris Thorn Biotech, a corporation that has zero affiliation with this family, and I'm not here to license it to you." "Then why are you here?" Silas demanded, his eyes narrowing. "You said you had a solution. You said you'd save the land." "I will save the land," I said, reaching into my case and pulling out a thick, legal-grade document I had prepared with my own team of specialized intellectual property attorneys. I slid it across the table. It was a heavy, daunting pile of paper, bound in black. Silas picked up the document, his hands trembling slightly. As he read the first few pages, his face went from pale to a deep, dangerous crimson. He looked up at me, his mouth agape. This is a total transfer of title," Silas whispered. "You're demanding that the entire Thorn estate, the manor, the 10,000 acres, the water rights, and the mineral deeds be transferred to your name for $1? "That's impossible," Leo screamed. "That land is our entire net worth. You're robbing us." "I'm not robbing you, Leo," I said, sitting back in the oversized leather chair that used to be my grandfather's. "I'm offering you an exit strategy. If I don't apply the Gaia serum within the next 48 hours, the blight becomes permanent. The banks take the land. You'll be left with nothing but the clothes you just put back on and a mountain of debt. If you sign this, I clear the blight, I pay off the bank loans with my own capital, and you get to keep your law firm and your city penthouses. You lose the land, but you keep your freedom." "You're a thorn!" Silas shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "How can you be so cold? This is your heritage. Your brothers were supposed to inherit this." "My brothers were supposed to protect this," I shot back, my voice rising for the first time. "You called me a lab rat. You mocked my mud. Well, the mud is the only thing that matters now. I don't want to be a chief scientist in your crumbling empire. I want to be the owner of the ground I stand on. You have 1 hour to review the contract. My lawyers are on standby for a digital signing." I stood up and walked to the large library window. Outside, the gray fog was thickening. I could see the dead husks of the prize-winning orchards. It was a graveyard of arrogance. 1 hour, Silas," I said, not turning around. "After that, I take my blue stuff and I go back to my lab, and you can spend the rest of your life arguing in court about whose fault it was that you died in the dirt." I felt a strange sense of peace. For 25 years, I had been the invisible girl. Now, I was the only thing standing between my family and the abyss, and the view from the top was much clearer than it was from the lab.
The grandfather clock in the library ticked with the weight of a guillotine. Every second that passed was another square meter of soil rendered sterile by the creeping gray blight. My father and brothers sat huddled at the far end of the long mahogany table, their shadows stretched thin by the flickering firelight. They weren't discussing the law anymore, they were negotiating their survival. I stood by the window, watching the digital countdown on my tablet. 59 minutes, 58. They were running out of air, and they finally knew it. Silas broke the silence first. His voice was a rasp, stripped of the booming resonance that had dominated courtrooms for 40 years. Eris, this is more than just a transfer of land. You're asking for the water rights, the mineral deeds, and the historical easements. You're effectively erasing us from the history of this county. This land has been in the Thorn name since 1890. And if you don't sign, it will be in the bank's name by Monday, I said, not turning from the window. History is a luxury of the living, Silas. Right now, you're the captain of a sinking ship arguing about who gets to keep the heirloom silver. The land is dying. I am the only person on this planet who can perform the resuscitation. My lawyers have already verified the deed transfer documents. One digital signature, and I begin the extraction of the pathogen. Marcus, ever the strategist, stood up and walked toward the cases I had left near the door. His eyes were narrow, filled with a desperate, calculating glint. You know, Eris, we've been thinking, if this technology is as powerful as you say, it's probably a matter of national security. Perhaps we shouldn't be signing over family assets. Perhaps we should be calling our contacts in the Department of Defense. They'd be very interested in a soil reset button. I turned slowly, a thin smile playing on my lips. Go ahead, Marcus, call them. By the time they clear the bureaucratic red tape, mobilize a task force, and realize they can't reverse engineer my microbial strains without the base code, which is encrypted in a satellite-locked server, this land will be a salt flat. You're trying to play a high-stakes game with a hand full of zeros. Sit down. Marcus didn't sit. Instead, he reached for one of the smaller canisters, his hand trembling. I just want to see what we're talking about. Is it just a chemical? A liquid? Touch that canister and I'll have the automated security protocols on my server lock you out of the estate's power grid before you can blink. That's not just a liquid, it's a pressurized colony of synthesized extremophiles. If you breach the seal without the atmospheric stabilizer, they'll oxidize and die in seconds. You'll have a bottle of expensive blue water and a foreclosure notice. Is that what you want? Leo, the youngest and always the most fragile, finally cracked. Just sign it, Dad. I can't live like this. The reporters are already at the gates. If we lose the farm and the law firm goes under because of the debt, we're finished. At least if Eris has the land, it stays with a Thorn, technically. Silas looked at his youngest son with a mixture of pity and disgust. Then he looked at me. For the first time, he saw me not as his disappointed daughter, but as a mirror image of himself, cold, precise, and utterly ruthless when the prize was in sight. He realized I hadn't just studied biology, I had studied him. With a shaking hand, Silas reached for the digital stylus. He scrolled through hundreds of pages of the transfer agreement, his legal mind likely screaming at the sheer one-sidedness of the deal. He reached the final page. With a sharp, jagged motion, he signed. Then Marcus, then Leo. The tablet chimed. Transfer confirmed, title registered, Dr. Eris Thorn, Biotech. There. Silas spat, throwing the stylus on the table. You've robbed your own father. I hope you're happy with your dirt. Now save the damn farm. With pleasure, I said, the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders. I wasn't a guest anymore. I was the owner. I moved with the precision of a surgeon. I directed Marcus and Leo to assist with the deployment of the extraction pylons, 6-foot-tall carbon fiber rods that had to be driven into the earth at specific GPS coordinates around the perimeter of the primary infection zone. They grumbled and cursed, their expensive leather shoes sinking into the gray, foul-smelling muck, but they obeyed. For the first time in their lives, they were my subordinates.
"Drive it deeper, Marcus," I shouted through my comms unit as I stood on the manor's balcony, monitoring the subsurface readings. "The sensor needs to reach the clay layer. If we don't anchor the microbial bloom, the wind will carry it to the neighbor's property, and I haven't charged them for the service yet." Once the pylons were set, I activated the central hub. In the heart of the library, I opened the primary case. Inside, cradled in a magnetic suspension field, was the Gaia core, a glowing sapphire blue cylinder that pulsed with a faint rhythmic light. This was my life's work. Thousands of hours of genetic sequencing, billions of iterations of trial and error, all contained in a liter of bioluminescent fluid. I connected the core to the estate's irrigation mainframe, which I had spent the last hour hacking and reconfiguring. "Initiating Phase 1, the extraction," I whispered. I hit the execute key. Deep underground, the pumps groaned to life, but it wasn't water moving through the pipes, it was a deluge of silver and blue. Through the glass observation ports I had installed on the pylons, I watched as the Gaia serum hit the soil. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Where the blue liquid touched the gray blight, a thick white mist began to rise from the earth. It looked like the ground was breathing, a heavy tectonic sigh. This was the microbes engaging in molecular predation. They were literally tearing the synthetic fungus apart at a carbon level, turning the poison into steam and nitrogen. "Look at that," Leah whispered, standing near one of the pilers. "The gray, it's receding. It's actually turning back to brown." "It's not just turning brown, Leo," I said, joining them on the lawn. I knelt down and scooped up a handful of the treated earth. It was warm to the touch, vibrating with the energy of billions of microscopic battles. I stood up, the damp earth staining my white lab coat. Silas stood on the porch, watching the mist rise across his former kingdom. He looked broken, but I felt nothing but a cold, crystalline satisfaction. "You have 24 hours to pack your personal belongings from the manor," I said to my brothers and father. "The law firm is yours to keep, but this house, this land, and every blade of grass on it belongs to Eris Thorn Biotech. I have a team of researchers arriving tomorrow morning. We're turning the manor into a world-class soil institute." "You're kicking us out?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. "Where are we supposed to go?" "You're lawyers," I said, walking past them toward my new home. "I'm sure you can find a loophole, or, if you're lucky, you can find a nice apartment in the city that doesn't require you to look at mud. After all, it's an embarrassment to the legacy, right?" I walked into the manor and closed the heavy oak doors. For the first time in my life, I wasn't a lab rat in someone else's maze. I had built my own world, and the foundation was deeper than they could ever imagine.
Victory in the laboratory is a clean, binary thing. The experiment either works or it doesn't. But victory in the real world is a messy, sprawling affair that attracts predators like blood in the water. The moment the white mist began to clear from the Thorn estate, revealing rich, dark earth where there had been only gray ash, I knew the clock had reset. I was no longer just the eccentric daughter. I was the holder of the most valuable biological asset in the agricultural sector. And my brothers, true to their nature, weren't going to let a signed contract stand in the way of a billion-dollar payday. The morning after the successful extraction, the estate felt different. The heavy sulfurous smell had been replaced by the scent of fresh rain and ozone, the byproduct of billions of microbes exhausting nitrogen into the atmosphere. I sat in the library, which was now cluttered with high-speed servers and biochemical analyzers, watching the global markets. News of the Thorn miracle had leaked. The agricultural indices were fluctuating wildly. Everyone wanted to know how a condemned wasteland had been restored in 48 hours. My phone was a graveyard of missed calls from venture capitalists, government agencies, and, predictably, my brother Marcus's law partners. "Eris, we need to talk," Marcus said, stepping into the library without knocking. He wasn't wearing his suit anymore. He had found some old hunting clothes in the mudroom, but his eyes were still as sharp and predatory as ever. "I believe the eviction notice said you had 24 hours, Marcus," I said, not looking up from my monitors. "You have 6 left. I suggest you spend them packing your cufflinks." "Don't be a child," he snapped, leaning over my desk. "I've spent the night reviewing the transfer deed with 3 of the top contract specialists in the country. We're filing an injunction in the morning. You used undue influence and economic duress to coerce Silas into signing. No judge in this state will uphold a contract that strips a family of their entire heritage in exchange for a bottle of blue liquid." "It's not blue liquid, Marcus," I replied calmly. "And as for duress, I simply presented a choice. The bank was going to take the land anyway. I saved the asset. If you sue me, the first thing I'll do is stop the maintenance cycle of the Gaia microbes. Without the secondary stabilizer, the bloat will return within a week. Do you want to own a court case over a pile of toxic dust?" Marcus turned pale, but before he could respond, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the driveway, followed by 2 more. They didn't have the markings of the bank or the government. They were sleek, professional, and dangerous. "Who the hell is that?" Marcus asked, his legal bravado momentarily replaced by genuine confusion. "That," I said, standing up and checking my security feed, "is Aegis Agrochemicals." Aegis was the silent giant of the industry. They owned the patents for the fertilizers and pesticides that 70% of the world used. If my Gaia serum could restore soil without their chemicals, I wasn't just a scientist, I was an existential threat to their entire business model. A man in a gray, impeccably tailored suit stepped out of the lead vehicle. This was Victor Vane, the CEO of Aegis. He didn't wait for an invitation. He walked toward the house with the confidence of a man who usually bought what he wanted and destroyed what he couldn't. I met him on the porch. Silas and Leo followed me out, looking like spectators at their own execution. "Dr. Thorne," Victor Vane said, his voice a smooth, modulated baritone, "the drone footage of your estate is impressive. My R&D department said what you did was impossible. I'm here to make sure they're wrong." "They're not wrong, Mr. Vane," I said. "They're just obsolete. What can I do for you?" "I'll be direct. Aegis wants the Gaia patent. All of it. The base code, the microbial strains, and the atmospheric stabilization formulas. We're prepared to offer you $500 million in cash and a 2% royalty on all future soil restoration contracts globally. You'll be the richest scientist in history." I heard Leo gasp behind me. $500 million. It was more than the estate was worth at its peak. I felt Silas's hand on my shoulder, a heavy, trembling weight. "Sign it, Eris," Silas whispered. "Sign it and we can split the proceeds. We can forget the deed transfer. This is the ambition I always wanted for you." I looked at Vane. I knew his history. Aegis didn't buy patents to use them. They bought them to bury them. If I sold him Gaia, the serum would never see a field again. Farmers would stay dependent on Aegis's expensive, soil-stripping chemicals. The Blight X, which I'm strongly suspected Aegis had a hand in developing, would continue to be the stick that forced people to buy the Aegis carrot. "The patent isn't for sale, Mr. Vane," I said. Vane's smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned cold.
Dr. Thorne, let's not play games. Your brothers have already reached out to our legal department. They've indicated that the title to this land and the intellectual property is currently under significant legal dispute. If I can't buy the patent from you, I'll simply fund their lawsuit, drag you through the courts for a decade, and take it from the survivors. I turned to look at Marcus. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He had already sold me out. Again. He had contacted the very predators who had likely poisoned our land just to get a piece of the pie I had baked. You called them? I asked Marcus, my voice a whisper of pure, concentrated fury. It's just business, Eris, Marcus shouted. You can't expect us to just walk away. Aegis is a powerhouse. With them, the Thorne name stays relevant. The Thorne name is a parasite, I said. I turned back to Victor Vane. Mr. Vane, you're a lawyer by trade, aren't you? You believe in contracts. Well, here's a new one. In exactly 60 seconds, my servers will broadcast the encrypted base code of the Gaia Serum to every open-source biological database in the world. It will be public domain, open source, free for every farmer, every university, and every small-town lab. Vane's face finally cracked. You're lying. You'd destroy a billion-dollar asset just to spite me? It's not spite. It's science, I said, holding up my tablet. If I can't own it exclusively because of my family's greed, then nobody will own it, and your $500 million offer will be worth the paper it's printed on. You have 45 seconds to get off my land before I hit send. If you're gone, I might reconsider and keep it private for another 24 hours while I negotiate with the UN. Vane looked at the tablet, then at my face. He saw that I wasn't a negotiator. I was a zealot. He signaled to his men. We're leaving. For now. But Dr. Thorne, the world doesn't like people who break the rules of the game. You've made some very expensive enemies today. As the SUVs roared away, the silence on the porch was deafening. I turned to Silas, Marcus, and Leo. You have 5 hours left, and if I hear the word injunction again, I don't just send the code to the public. I send the evidence of your Baltic accounts, which I found in the estate's backup server, to the Internal Revenue Service. I'm a lab rat, remember? I'm very good at finding where the crumbs are hidden. I walked back into the house and locked the door. I just turned a billion-dollar fortune into a war for the planet's future, and for the first time in my life, I felt like a true Thorne.
The world of high finance and corporate law is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of scientists. They think we are fragile, ivory tower idealists who will crumble at the first sign of physical or legal pressure. They don't realize that a woman who has spent a decade managing volatile isotopes and hyper-aggressive bacteria has a nerve system made of carbon fiber. When Victor Vane and Aegis Agrochemicals retreated from my porch, I knew they weren't going away. They were just switching tactics. Within 12 hours, my family's ancestral home, my new laboratory, was no longer a residence. It was a besieged fortress. By dawn, the perimeter of the Thorne estate was lined with protesters. I watched them through the high-resolution thermal cameras I had installed during the night. They carried professionally printed signs, Thorne Biotech, playing God with our soil, and biological hazards in our backyard. It was a classic Aegis move, astroturfing a fake environmental movement to stir up public panic and justify a government intervention. My father and brothers were trapped inside with me. Their 5-hour eviction window had closed, but the protesters had blocked the gates, preventing anyone from leaving or entering. Silas paced the hallway like a caged lion, his silk robe flapping around his ankles.
"You've brought a lynch mob to our doors, Eris," Silas shouted, pointing at the monitors. "The local sheriff won't touch this. He says it's a public health concern. Aegis has the county commissioners in their pocket. They're going to declare this house a biohazard zone and seize everything." "Let them try," I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard. "The moment they breach the property line without a federal warrant signed by a judge I haven't already briefed, the automated fire suppression system will deploy a localized pheromone cloud. It won't hurt them, but it will make every bee and wasp in the county think they are a threat. It's an organic deterrent." Marcus stood in the corner, nursing a glass of scotch he'd scavenged from the cellar. He looked broken. "You're insane! You're going to get us killed! All for what? A patent you're willing to give away for free? You've destroyed the Thorn name, you've taken the land, and now you're turning us into domestic terrorists." "I'm turning you into witnesses, Marcus. Witnesses to the birth of a new era. Now, if you want to be useful, go to the basement. I need someone to monitor the pressure levels in the secondary bioreactors. If the nitrogen intake drops below 40%, the Gaia colony will go dormant. Do it, or I'll let the sheriff in and tell him you were the one who synthesized the original Blight X." "You wouldn't," Marcus whispered, though he already knew the answer. He put down his glass and headed for the stairs. He was a shark, but I was the ocean. I turned my attention back to the laboratory I had established in the manor's former grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers now hung over stainless steel fermentation tanks and gene sequencing machines. This was the production phase. I wasn't just maintaining the estate anymore. I was scaling up. I needed enough Gaia serum to treat the neighboring 3 counties. The synthesis of the final stage, Gaia Prime, was delicate. It required a specific oscillation of ultrasonic waves to harden the microbial cell walls, making them resistant to the industrial pesticides that Aegis would undoubtedly spray to try and kill my cure. My screen blinked. A drone was approaching. Not one of mine. It was a heavy-lift tactical drone, likely carrying a signal jammer or a payload of neutralizing agents. "Initiating electronic countermeasures," I muttered. I activated the signal scrambling array I had built using the estate's old satellite dishes. On the monitor, the intruder drone began to wobble, its navigation lights flickered, and then it plummeted, crashing into the gray mud of the dead zone near the orchard. "Score 1 for the lab rat," I said, but the victory was short-lived. A convoy of armored vehicles was now moving toward the main gates. These weren't protesters. These were Aegis security contractors, mercenaries in tactical gear, carrying high-pressure sprayers. They were going to try to disinfect my property by force. I hit the intercom. "Silas, Leo, get to the library, now!" They ran into the room, looking terrified. I handed them tablets. "Your lawyers, start recording. I've established a live stream to 5 major news outlets and the Environmental Protection Agency's internal server. If those men cross the fence, the world sees a private corporation attacking a private citizen on her own land. This is the only lawsuit that will save you now." Leo's hands shook as he held the tablet. "Eris, they have gas masks. They're starting to spray something at the gates." "It's a broad-spectrum fungicide," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "They're trying to kill the Gaia colony before it can spread to the water table. If they succeed, the soil will be permanently dead, and Aegis will claim they were cleaning up my mistake." I watched the monitors. The mercenaries were at the gates. One of them was preparing a thermal charge to blow the lock. I had seconds. "Executing Gaia Prime aerosolization." I hit the red command key. High above the manor, the modified irrigation sprinklers, the ones Silas had installed for his prize-winning roses, began to hiss.
But instead of water, it emitted a thick, glowing blue mist. It was beautiful and terrifying. The wind caught it, carrying the bioluminescent cloud toward the gates. The effect was immediate. The fungicide the mercenaries were spraying hit the Gaia mist and simply neutralized. The blue cloud was a living shield. It absorbed the toxins, using the chemicals as a catalyst to grow faster. The mercenaries stopped. Their sensors must have been going haywire. To them, it looked like they were being engulfed by a sentient, glowing fog. "What is that?" Silas asked, mesmerized by the blue light reflecting off the library's glass. "It's the future of agriculture, Dad. It's a self-defending ecosystem. My microbes are programmed to recognize any synthetic pesticide or fungicide as a threat. They're not just cleaning the soil, they're patrolling the air." The mercenaries retreated. They weren't prepared for biological warfare that fought back by being cleaner than their weapons. The armored vehicles backed away from the gate. Victor Vane had underestimated my willingness to turn his own tactics against him. But I knew this was just the first wave. While the blue mist held the perimeter, I had to complete the data upload. I began the process of broadcasting the Gaia base code. Upload progress, 45%, 50%. "Eris," Marcus's voice came over the intercom from the basement. "The bioreactors are redlining. Something is wrong. The pressure is spiking. I can't shut it down." I froze. Aegis hadn't just attacked the gates. They'd hacked the manor's legacy plumbing and electrical systems. They were trying to cause a catastrophic biospill from the inside, which would give the government all the legal grounds they needed to seize the patent and bury it forever. "Get out of there, Marcus," I screamed. "The tanks are going to breach." I grabbed my emergency kit and ran for the stairs. I had saved the land, but I was about to lose the house and potentially my life to the very brothers I had tried to outmaneuver. The siege wasn't just outside anymore. The enemy was in the pipes.
The basement of Thorn Manor was never intended to be a biological manufacturing hub. It was a labyrinth of 19th century stonework, rusted copper piping, and the damp smell of forgotten wine. Now, it was a death trap. As I raced down the stone steps, the air grew thick and humid, vibrating with the low-frequency hum of the overstressed bioreactors. Red emergency lights flickered against the damp walls, and the sound of hissing steam told me that Aegis's digital sabotage had hit the thermal regulators. If those tanks breached, it wouldn't just be a leak, it would be a microscopic explosion that would coat the entire estate in a concentrated, unstable bioslurry. I burst into the secondary fermentation room. Water was already ankle-deep, pouring from a ruptured cooling line. Marcus was huddled near the main control panel, his expensive loafers ruined, his hands frantically clawing at a manual override lever that wouldn't budge. "Eris! The pressure in Tank 4 is at 150 psi and climbing!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a fear I had never heard before. "The digital lockout is total! I can't even dump the cooling salts!" "Get back!" I shouted, wading through the water. I opened my emergency kit and pulled out a handheld diagnostic unit, plugging it directly into the tank's analog port. My hands were shaking, but my mind was a cold grid of equations. Aegis hadn't just spiked the heat, they had introduced a feedback loop into the agitators. The microbes weren't just growing, they were hyper-replicating, creating a massive buildup of CO2. "Leo, get the manual pressure relief valves," I commanded as my youngest brother appeared in the doorway, looking paralyzed. "They're behind the stone pillar. You have to turn them clockwise simultaneously. If you don't, the unequal pressure will shatter the glass viewports." I can't. They're too heavy," Leo stammered, his eyes wide. "Do it, Leo, or we all become the biological hazard Vane wants us to be."
I roared. To my shock, it wasn't Leo who moved first. Silas Thorne, the patriarch who had spent his life delegating the dirty work, stepped into the knee-deep water. He grabbed the first iron valve, his silk robe soaking up the contaminated liquid. "Help him, Leo!" Silas barked. "Now!" I turned back to the console. The Aegis virus was sophisticated. It was rewriting the operating system in real time. I couldn't fight it with code. I had to fight it with chemistry. I pulled a syringe of concentrated saline inhibitor from my belt. "Marcus, I need you to hold the injection port steady. The vibration is too strong. If I miss the seal, the pressure will spray this back into my face. It's highly caustic in this concentration." Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at the vibrating steel tank that looked ready to burst. Then, he stepped forward and gripped the port with both hands, his knuckles white. "Do it, Eris, just do it!" I jammed the needle into the seal and depressed the plunger. I watched the digital gauge, 160 psi, 165, then with a groan of protesting metal, the needle dipped. 160, 155. "It's working," I whispered. "The inhibitor is slowing the replication." But we weren't safe yet. The water was still rising, and the smell of electrical ozone was getting stronger. The main power junction for the house was in the next room, and it was about to be submerged. "The upload," I remembered, my heart stopping. "If the power goes out, the broadcast of the Gaia code will fail. It's only at 60%. "I'll go," Silas said. He was panting, his face pale from the physical exertion of holding the valve. "Silas, no," I said. "The water is electrified. If you touch the breaker box while standing in this, you'll be killed." "Then tell me what to do, lab rat," my father said, and for the first time the nickname didn't sound like an insult. It sounded like an acknowledgement of my expertise. He was looking at me, waiting for an order. The great Silas Thorne was waiting for my command. "There's a rubber mat on the top shelf of the wine cellar," I said quickly. "Throw it down, stand on it, use a wooden broom handle to flip the bypass switch. Do not touch the metal." As Silas disappeared into the dark, flooded hallway, Marcus and I stayed by the tank. The vibration was fading, but the room was still a nightmare of steam and shadows. "Why didn't you just take the $500 million, Eris?" Marcus asked quietly, his hands still on the tank. "We could have been on a beach in the Maldives. No blight, no basements, no death threats." "Because on that beach, you'd still be you, Marcus, and I'd still be the girl you mocked. But here, in this mud, I'm the only one who knows the way out. You can't buy the future, you have to grow it, and I'm tired of Aegis deciding what grows and what dies." A sudden crack echoed through the basement. The lights flickered, died, and then were replaced by the dim, red glow of the emergency battery backup. "The upload!" I scrambled for my tablet. It was waterproof, but the signal was weak through the stone walls. Progress 85%, 88%. "I did it!" Silas's voice echoed from the dark. "The bypass is holding. The servers should have backup power for another 10 minutes. Suddenly, the basement door at the top of the stairs burst open. The blue mist that I had deployed outside was being sucked into the house by the ventilation system, creating a surreal, glowing fog. But through the fog came a different sound, the heavy thud of boots. "They're inside," Leo whispered, retreating from his valve. "Vane's men. They must have breached the kitchen door." I looked at my brothers and my father, 4 people who had spent a lifetime at war with each other, now standing in a flooded basement covered in mud and microbial slime. "Marcus, Leo, take the heavy wrenches," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "Dad, stay behind the tank. If they want the Gaia code, they have to come through the water, and in this basement, I have the home field advantage." I reached into my kit and pulled a small pressurized spray bottle. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a concentrated pheromone trigger. "If they open that door," I told them, "I'm gonna spray the air. The the Gaia microbes in the fog will react to the pheromones by becoming hyper-adhesive. It'll be like walking into a room filled with invisible, glowing superglue. They won't be able to move an inch without tearing their own suits. We waited. The footsteps grew louder. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and a tactical flashlight cut through the blue mist. "Secure the assets," a voice barked. I looked at my tablet. Progress 99%, 100%. Upload complete. Broadcast public. I looked up at the door and smiled. "Welcome to the Thorn Institute," I whispered. "The tour is about to get very uncomfortable."
There is a specific kind of arrogance that comes with carrying a weapon into a laboratory. It's the belief that kinetic force can always trump intellectual property. As the heavy boots of the Aegis contractors thudded on the wooden floorboards above our heads, I realized that Victor Vane didn't just want the patent anymore. He wanted to erase the witnesses of his failure. But Vane was a man of the old world, a world of lead, steel, and fire. He didn't understand that in my world, the very air you breathe can be turned into a cage. The basement door swung open with a violent crash. 3 men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by high-end respirators, began their descent. Their flashlight beams sliced through the blue, bioluminescent mist that filled the room, making the subterranean chamber look like an underwater cave. "Stay back, Dad," I whispered, holding the pheromone trigger behind my back. Marcus and Leo stood on either side of the stairs, clutching heavy pipe wrenches. They looked terrified, but for the first time in their lives, they weren't looking for a legal loophole to escape. They were standing their ground. "Dr. Thorne," the lead contractor shouted, his voice muffled by his mask. "You are in violation of a court-ordered emergency seizure. Drop the equipment and put your hands behind your head. We are here to secure the hazardous materials." "The only hazardous material in this room is your lack of imagination," I said, my voice echoing off the damp stone walls. As the first man reached the bottom step, his boots splashing into the electrified water, which Silas had safely bypassed only moments ago, I squeezed the pheromone trigger on the canister. A fine, invisible mist hissed into the air. The reaction was beautiful in its efficiency. The Gaia microbes, already densely packed in the blue fog, responded to the pheromones as if they were a biological command to form structure. Within seconds, the air around the contractors began to thicken. It wasn't smoke or gas, it was a rapid molecular polymerization. The microbes began to link together, attaching themselves to the fabric of the tactical suits, the rubber of the masks, and the cold steel of the weapons. "What the? I can't move my arm," one of the men yelled. He tried to raise his rifle, but the weapon was already fused to his chest plate by a web of glowing blue filaments. "The more you struggle, the more they bind," I explained, stepping forward into the light. "It's a non-Newtonian biological adhesive. It reacts to kinetic energy. The harder you pull, the stiffer it becomes. You aren't being attacked, you're being preserved." The 3 men were frozen in place, looking like neon blue statues at the base of the stairs. They looked ridiculous, high-tech mercenaries defeated by a swarm of invisible, glowing janitors. "Eris, look!" Leo pointed to my tablet, which was still glowing on the workbench. The public broadcast had gone viral. Because I'd used an open-source biological network, the Gaia code wasn't just on a few servers, it was being mirrored by thousands of people across the globe. But there was something else. The Aegis leak had begun. While Vane's men were busy trying to breach my basement, my automated subroutines had successfully cracked the encrypted files I'd pulled from the estate's legacy server, files that Silas had hidden years ago. They contained the chemical signatures for blight
X, and the purchase orders were signed by a subsidiary of Aegis Agrochemicals. You had the proof all along, Silas? I asked, turning to my father. Silas looked down at the muddy water. I didn't have proof, Eris. I had suspicions. I kept those files as a poison pill in case they ever tried a hostile takeover. I didn't realize they would actually use the blight on us. I thought it was just a weapon they sold to others. You were willing to let the world burn as long as you had a secret to trade, I said, the disgust clear in my voice. But today, the trade is over. I grabbed my tablet and initiated a direct video link. I knew Victor Vane would be watching. I didn't have to wait long. His face appeared on the screen, his polished veneer finally replaced by a mask of cold, murderous fury. "You've made a mistake, Dr. Thorne," he hissed. "You've released a classified biological agent into the public domain. You'll be hunted by every government on the planet for bioterrorism." "Actually, Victor," I said, holding the tablet up so he could see his frozen mercenaries behind me, "I've just released the cure for the poison you created. The Gaia Code is already being verified by the WHO and the UN, and while we're talking, the evidence linking Aegis to the creation of Blight X is being downloaded by every major news outlet in the world. You're not a CEO anymore. You're a fugitive." "You think you've won because of some data?" Vane smeared. "I have lawyers who will tie you in knots for a century. I'll buy the judges. I'll buy the politicians." "You can't buy the soil, Victor," I replied. "I've just made your entire chemical catalog obsolete. Why would a farmer buy your pesticides when they can grow a self-healing ecosystem for the price of a liter of water and my open-source code? You didn't just lose a lawsuit, you lost your market. You're a dinosaur watching the asteroid hit." I hit the end call button. The room fell silent, except for the rhythmic dripping of water and the heavy breathing of the trapped men. "What now?" Marcus asked, leaning against a stone pillar, his pipe wrench still in hand. He looked at me with a new kind of respect, not the respect of a brother, but the respect of a soldier for a general. "Now we open the doors," I said. "The media is already at the gate. The protesters are gone, replaced by real journalists. We walk out of here, we give them the truth, and then we start the restoration." "And the land?" Silas asked. "The deed is still in your name." "The land is the Thorne Institute now. It's no longer a family bank account, it's a global research hub. You can stay, Silas. You can even keep your library. But you're going to learn how to be a librarian, not a lord. And Marcus, Leo, if you want to stay, you'd better learn how to use a microscope. The era of the lawyer is over. The era of the lab rat has begun." I led them up the stairs, past the glowing, frozen mercenaries. As we walked through the grand foyer and out onto the front porch, the morning sun was finally breaking through the clouds. The blue mist was dissipating, leaving behind a sparkling dew on the ground. The gray was gone. The earth was a deep, vibrant black. I stood on the steps of my manor, flanked by the men who had once looked down on me. Thousands of cameras flashed, microphones were thrust in my face, but I didn't see the crowd. I saw the fields. I saw the life returning to the dirt. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne, and I have finally cleaned the house.
Time is the ultimate biological catalyst. In the laboratory, we speed it up. In life, we simply endure it. 1 year has passed since the night the blue mist transformed Thorn Manor from a crumbling legal dynasty into a beacon of scientific revolution. The world outside has moved on from the headlines of the Great Aegis collapse, but here, on these 10,000 acres, the revolution is just beginning to bear fruit. The gray ash is a ghost of the past, and the soil beneath my feet is now the most studied patch of earth in human history. I stood on the edge of the north orchard, the morning sun warming the back of my neck. Beside me, rows of heirloom apple trees, once twisted, blackened husks, were heavy with fruit. Their leaves were a vibrant, waxy green, pulsing with the silent energy of the Gaia Prime microbes that lived within their roots. This wasn't just a farm anymore. It was a living, breathing proof of concept. The Thorne Institute for Regenerative Biosciences was no longer a dream. The manor had been fully converted. The grand ballroom remained a state-of-the-art lab, but the library was now a global database where scientists from 6 continents accessed our open-source research. We had decentralized the power of life. A shadow fell across the grass. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. "The Brix levels are off the charts, Eris," Marcus said, holding a portable refractometer. He wasn't wearing a 3-piece suit. He was in durable work trousers and a flannel shirt, his skin tanned by a year of actual labor. "These apples have more natural sugars and minerals than anything produced in the last 50 years. We just got the final analysis from the European Distribution Hub. They want a priority contract." "There are no priority contracts, Marcus," I reminded him, taking the device from his hand. "We provide the seeds and the Gaia starter to everyone at cost. We aren't a monopoly, we're a foundation." Marcus smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "I know, old habits die hard, but you have to admit, seeing the Aegis bankruptcy filing yesterday was satisfying. Victor Vane is facing 20 years for environmental sabotage, and their stock is worth less than the dirt they tried to poison." "Vane tried to own the earth, Marcus. He forgot that you can only borrow it." My brother, the former corporate shark, nodded. He had spent the last 12 months overseeing the logistics of our global seed distribution program. He used his legal mind to navigate international trade laws, not to exploit them, but to bypass the barriers that Aegis and their ilk had built to keep farmers dependent. He was still a strategist, but now he was playing for the other side. We walked back toward the manor. In the distance, I saw Leo. He was leading a group of graduate students through the experimental wheat fields. Leo had found his calling in environmental communications. He was the voice of the Institute, the one who translated my complex genetic equations into hope for people who had lost their livelihoods to the blight. As we approached the stone steps of the house, Silas Thorne was sitting in a rocking chair on the porch. He held a thick book in his lap, but he wasn't reading. He was watching the drones, my drones, as they patrolled the perimeter, misting the air with protective microbial arrays. "The regulators from the EPA are coming at noon, Eris," Silas said as I stepped onto the porch. He didn't need to perform for me anymore. The hierarchy of the family had been permanently flattened. "They want to discuss the Gaia Shield for the national parks. They're offering a federal grant." "I don't need their money to run this place." Silas looked out over the fields. "You know, when you were a child, I thought you were just difficult. I thought you were hiding in the basement because you couldn't handle the pressure of being a thorn. I didn't realize you were building a world where being a thorn didn't mean what I thought it did." "It means something now, Silas," I said, sitting on the steps. "It means we're the ones who fix what others break. That's a better legacy than a bank account." He reached out and placed a rough, weathered hand on my shoulder. It was the hand of a man who had spent the last year helping me catalog soil samples. There was no more talk of undue influence or legal disputes.
The contract we had signed in the library had been replaced by a much older agreement, mutual survival. The legacy of the lab rat had become a global standard. The Gaia Code had been downloaded over 10 million times. In India, in Brazil, in sub-Saharan Africa, people are using my blue stuff to reclaim land that had been written off as dead. The Thorn Institute was the heart of a network that was slowly, stitch by stitch, repairing the planet's skin. I looked at my tablet one last time before the afternoon's work began. There were no alerts, no crises, no corporate counterstrikes, just a steady stream of data showing that the life signs of the planet were, for the first time in a century, beginning to stabilize. "Eris?" Leo called out from the field, waving a handful of wheat. "You need to see this. The protein density is even higher than the simulations predicted. We've triggered a secondary symbiotic bloom." I stood up, a sense of profound peace washing over me. I wasn't just a scientist anymore. I was a guardian. "I'm coming, Leo," I shouted back. I looked at Marcus and Silas. "The audit is over. It's time for the harvest." As I walked down the steps and back into the field, I realized that my father had been right about one thing. Success is tangible, but it's not measured in mahogany tables or court victories. It's measured in the warmth of the soil, the weight of the fruit, and the knowledge that the ground beneath you will still be there, healthy and whole, long after your name is forgotten. My name is Dr. Eris Thorn. I was the lab rat, the disappointment, and the ghost. But today I am the owner of the dirt, and the dirt is finally free.